I was asked to speak about this country, E Pluribus Unum, and the possibilities for a country with that kind of motto. And I've given it a great deal of thought. And I know that right now is a very tough time in our country. I know it feels sometimes depressing. It feels as though we're very polarized. It feels as though there's a great deal of hatred in this country. And I just want to remind everyone that there wasn't a better time. This has never actually been a unified country. I mean, E Pluribus Unum means out of many, one. But that motto was always aspirational. It was never representational. This country began as a bunch of disparate colonies of disgruntled Englishmen, a bunch of arrogant Frenchmen, some tight-lipped Puritans, some stoic Germans and their sausages, impatient Spaniards, and of course the black slaves that they dragged along with them almost from the very beginning. It was not unified then. But you know what? Let's go a little further back than that. Before Magellan, before Columbus, before Eric the Red, back to the time when it was the native tribes that were in this country. They were not unified. I mean, part of the reason that Native Americans lost their land, I mean, despite beyond the duplicity of the colonists, is that often the tribes hated each other more than these smelly, pale-skinned settlers that came with this audacious idea that you can own a piece of land. That's part of what doomed the native tribes, their disunity among themselves. And they all looked very much the same. So, if you take any hope out of it, it's that, look, hating one another has nothing to do with your appearance. The Continental Congress, think of the Continental Congress. It was one of the most contentious, most divided bodies in history. I would say it was the most divided, but I'm sure some of you have been to Washington recently. So I'm not going to make that claim. But this country almost never was. People forget that. We almost did not declare independence from Britain because they couldn't agree on the details. One of those details, of course, was slavery. And I'm sure many of you know that in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, and I'm going to make sure I read this correctly, there was a specific complaint, argument against slavery. In it, Thomas Jefferson wrote that King George had waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. In fact, Thomas Jefferson brooded for the rest of his life over the removal of that passage. He never forgave the representatives of South Carolina and Georgia who made him take it out of the Declaration in order to achieve unanimity. And that's a little ironic if you think about it. This is a point. We talk about amity really helping us to bring about universality, but this is a case in which, in Philadelphia in 1775, racial amity was set aside in order to more favor unanimity. So let me point out a few more ironies for you. Let's not forget that this man, Thomas Jefferson, who was espousing the cause of African slaves before this country was founded, was, of course, a slave owner. And years later in Paris, he would fall in love with his brown-skinned house slave. So do we think of Thomas Jefferson as a monster? Of course we don't. Was the institution of slavery monstrous? Of course. But let me kind of riff on this theme of duality and irony related to race history in this country. The passage that Jefferson was forced to remove from the Declaration of Independence very appropriately accused the British king of fostering, really, the slave trade. I mean, the first African slave was dropped onto British soil in the 1500s. Bristol and Liverpool were two major ports in the triangle trade. So here's this cocky American scolding the British king for fostering the slave trade. And yet, Britain got rid of slavery a long time before the cocky Americans did. And it was actually diplomatic pressure from Britain that helped free the slaves, the African slaves who'd been brought to this soil on l'Amistad, the slave ship. We need to remember that when we start feeling good about ourselves. I mention these points to point out that not even in and of ourselves are we united, not even in our own individual persons. Don't we always say, well, I'm divided, I'm torn, I'm of two minds on this issue? So if we can't bring ourselves to be united, it's no surprise that we can't agree on a lot of things as a nation either. and that includes race. Out of many, one. I would very much like to believe that at some point we can all look at our fellow countrymen and say, we are one people. We are united under the flag. We're united under the Constitution that guarantees our rights. And the part of me that is a musician does believe that will happen someday. But the other half of me is a journalist, and she ain't buying it. Because I don't think it's ever going to happen. Americans can't even agree on what the Constitution says. Think about it. There are as many interpretations of the words of the Constitution almost as there are of the Bible. You can read anything into that document if you argue long enough. So I'm sorry to say, I do not believe we will ever be truly unified. But I do believe we can still live together, unified or not, peacefully, respectfully, and amicably. So maybe, as I said, at this point, it feels as though we're farther away from that than we ever were before. And to a certain extent, you're right. To another extent, you're wrong. We aren't further away from it than ever before. And on this point, we can be optimistic. So I'm not going to insult anybody's intelligence or offend anyone by even using the term post-racial. I don't know who the unfortunate schmuck was who came up with that phrase to describe this country in the age of Obama. I feel sorry for them. They have very smartly disappeared from the media. But at this point, what's happening now makes post-racial sound, well, I guess ironic is the best word that we could use. Things are very tense right now. I mean, we know that. There's a great deal of hatred in this country. I hear it all the time. I hear it in the criticisms of our president, which are so often not based on his policies or his actions. I hear it in the criticism of immigrants coming in from whatever Spanish-speaking country they're coming from. I hear it in my own African-American communities. I was in Detroit for a very, very long time. You want to go find racism among the African-American community? Go to the Motor City, which I love, that city. But believe me, the racism is on both sides of 8 Mile. So yes, absolutely, our country is divided. It is filled with hate and anger and fear of one another. A part of that, I mean, I have to say, as a journalist, is my fault. My industry's fault. Because conflict sells newspapers, and everyone knows we need to sell some newspapers. Conflict sells cable news. It sells advertising on CNN. Conflict helps to pay for my salary. Thankfully, I work for public radio, so not too much conflict. I mean, Terry Gross doesn't argue all that much. But my conflict helps pay for the salaries of my colleagues at the New York Times. I do not eschew responsibility for what's happening in our nation at all. I think the media is at least 40% responsible for what's going on. Personally, you would think I would be absolutely fantastic at covering multicultural news. I mean, how could you possibly get better? I'm an African American, lots of Caucasian in me. I'm Native American, I'm Jewish, I'm part Spanish, I'm part Scotch-Irish, many other interesting nationalities mixed in there. I'm a Buddhist. For 13 years, I was a single mother. So if you're talking about somebody who's coming from the voice of the underrepresented or the underdog, that would be me. But I really caution you that just because someone is a brown person, of whatever shade of brown they are, that does not mean they're going to cover brown news or brown people responsibly or fairly or without bias. Our entire system is infected with racial bias. I myself am compromised by my country, my environment, the voices I speak to every single day, the curriculum I was taught in school, the television that I watch, the movies that I watch, the topics that are trending on Twitter, the books that I read. I'm reading that and absorbing that as an American citizen. How well that meshes with my multicultural background is anybody's guess. And that does not make me any kind of authority on covering minority news. So I want to give you an example straight out of the newsroom, and this is a real example of what goes on when we're covering so-called minority news. Okay. Every day in the newsroom, we get done with a show and we're trying to plan what's on the next day's show. And all the editors will sit down and decide what are the stories which have, we call it national legs. They have national bearing and meaning, right? So is it important enough to interest a national audience? So let's say I pitch a story out of Cleveland, hypothetically. Maybe it's a great story. Maybe it's about a community that has grouping together, merging their combined buying power and all of their influence to purchase up the vacant properties in their neighborhood and either tear them down or entice new development. Maybe it's a great story with great voices. And so the editors are going to hear this pitch and they're immediately going to start thinking, well, if we were going to do this story, what guest am I going to book? Is it just a local voice? Is it just one of these people out of Cleveland? If that's the case, then the senator they have from Illinois that says he'll come on tomorrow gets priority. The local person out from Cleveland loses to the senator. So maybe the pitch sounds interesting to somebody in the newsroom, but the Wall Street Journal reported that, you know, this is happening all the time. That's no big deal. What's happening there is not a big deal. So the Wall Street Journal takes as priority. That story loses because an established news source poo-pooed it. So no matter what the reasoning, the story that appears in the Washington Post and the New York Times wins over the one that runs in the Cleveland Plain Dealer every time. And that's really too bad, because I can tell you from the inside, I mean, I've worked for National Public Radio for well over a decade. Our partners on the takeaway are the New York Times and the BBC. The national news sources don't cover news of brown people very well at all. Not the New York Times, not NPR, though God love us, we try very hard. They don't cover these stories well at all, which means if you're looking for credibility out of the pages of the New York Times or the morning edition, you're not going to find it. And so those stories coming out of Cleveland or Detroit or Woodville, Mississippi will always lose. Always. And it doesn't matter if that brown person who's making the decision is very brown, slightly brown, or white. It doesn't matter. They were trained probably in Columbia Journalism School, and this is how they learned how to do it. This is how journalism is done in our country. And that's why you can't trust me. You can't trust me to tell your stories. You can't. Okay. The core of the problem here, though, and it's a phrase that I keep using, and I apologize now and in advance for the future, for all the times I'm going to use it, is this phrase minority news, minority coverage. Diversity coverage, we say it all the time. When the fact of the matter is there is no such thing as minority news. There is local news and there's national news. And there's coverage that should reflect the audience you're speaking to, and there's coverage that's like about, you know, CERN, Switzerland, and high science. That's it. There's no such thing as minority news. What's minority news? This is where NPR gets it wrong all the time. And look, I work for NPR. I can criticize them. They're so anthropological. Look at what black people are doing in Illinois. Look at what brown people are doing in Austin, Texas. There's no such thing as diversity coverage. It's just news. If it's a great story, it's a great story, run it. And it doesn't matter if the person is bright white as your tablecloth or the person is as brown as the chair. This is the problem. When you start getting diversity initiatives in news, when people start talking about attracting diverse demographics, you have lost the battle already. I will tell you that right now. NPR has done this so many times, I can't even tell you. And again, I love NPR. And compared to many news sources, which I shall not name, NPR does it better than a lot of media sources. But come on, you're going to attract black people to NPR with a show done by Tavis Smiley that just talks about black people and jazz and only invites authors that are black? Really? Black people only want to hear about black people, spoken to by black people, about black people. I don't know what demographic that is, but I have never met any such animal in my life. But this is how they keep doing it. So when you notch in that, let me complain a little bit more about my own industry. Let's say you watch a newscast and all of the experts are white. This is another place where the media does you dirty. All of the experts are going to be white. And then they're going to go to the real people, the man on the street. We call it MOS tape, man on the street. Guess what color those men on the street are? That's where your diversity coverage comes in. That's where CNN gets all those tallies of how many diverse people they have on CNN through man on the street coverage. That means they're allowed to interview all the white politicians and all the white professors, and usually men, and all the white experts they can find. But they get their total number, their head count of diversity up, because then they go to man on the street and they say, what do you think about having to pay more taxes? And the person goes, that ain't right. Back to you, Janet. So man on the street is also not your friend. The fact is that the answer cannot be doing a head count. These quotas, counting people up, head counts are bad. You can't reach some quota of brown people, and that somehow gives you a pass because you've done diversity correctly. The story of race relations is really one of very, very conflicting narratives. To understand race is to experience cognitive dissonance, and it always has been. Let me take us back in history one more time, if you'll oblige me. I mean, obviously it was very largely middle and upper class whites who enslaved blacks. But the horror of slavery is not diminished in the slightest by admitting there were the rare slave owners who actually did their best to make the lives of their slaves healthy and better. They existed. Does that make slavery any less horrible? Of course it doesn't. Does it make those particular slave owners less than monsters? Yes. And we don't hurt the cause of arguing against slavery by admitting that not all of them were demons from the pits of hell. My own great-great-grandfather was a Scotch-Irish overseer. My great-great-grandmother had 6 children by 3 different white men. None of them were consensual. That's a horrible, horrible thing. But after the Civil War was over, my white great-great-grandfather loved his multiracial kids more than he loved his white kids, and he gave them all a college education and a piece of land. That was a good thing. I have a college degree in my family going back to the 1870s and 80s. There's a lot of white families that can't say that. So do I think my great-great-grandfather was not the greatest individual? Of course. Do I think he was a monster? No. Does that mean I'm condoning slavery? Get real. Come on. So let me bring it forward a little bit. Let's remember the 2008 election, before Barack Obama came the nominee. When he first announced he'd be running for president, what happened? All of the older a large number of the older African Americans did not support him. They supported Hillary Clinton. I'm not very old, but I was one of them. And I was filled with dread at the idea that this young man was going to run for president. I thought it was the worst idea ever. I thought it was going to make things worse. I thought it would just bring down a great deal of hatred on the African American community. I just thought to myself, you know, my God, you must be the most arrogant guy on the planet to be willing to bring up that kind of racial dislike and distrust in this country just so you can get your name in the papers. That's what I thought about Barack Obama, and I had covered him when he was in the state senate in Illinois, and I had nothing but admiration for this man. Okay, so that was my feeling when he first entered. I supported Hillary Clinton, not quite as long as my older African American relatives did. They held on to the end, but I cannot even imagine a more wonderful occasion, a more wonderful justification for admitting how wrong that I was. I mean, the feelings that I'd had, which were deep-seated when he first entered the race, do you think that has any bearing on the way that I felt when he stood there on Inauguration Day and took his vow? And it has nothing to do with politics. I promise you, my family is Republican going way, way back. It doesn't matter. I wouldn't give a damn if it was a Republican up there taking the vow. It's not political. It's the fact that 2 generations ago, my grandparents had to get married in Mexico. It was illegal for them to get married. And at the time that they got married, Multiracial families were being dragged out of their homes and burnt, beaten to death. My grandfather built a 6-foot fence around his house in Los Angeles to protect his children. They drove them to school every single day. My mother never walked to school because they were so afraid that they were going to be killed or harmed in some way of their children. When my grandfather was going to accept an honorary doctorate at Oberlin Conservatory, they drove. They drove from Los Angeles all the way to Oberlin, Ohio. And he couldn't sleep the entire drive because he couldn't stay in the white hotels. She couldn't stay in the black hotels. So they never got to stop. He drove all the way straight through to Oberlin. And if you see the pictures of him, he's standing there in his cap and gown going, And I'm told that one of the officials from Oberlin said, wow, William Grant Still is really he's looking bad. Well, he was exhausted. So for me to stand there and watch in 2 generations, Barack Obama raise his right hand and put his hand on the Bible and become the president of our country, I was absolutely ready to say that I was wrong. So was I a terrible person for being afraid in the beginning? No. Was I redeemed by the fact that I was happy when he became president? No. I was the exact same stupid, emotional person I was all the way along. The labels never fit. You couldn't label me at the first decision. You couldn't redeem me at the second decision. That's the problem with race. One statement that you make, one decision that you make doesn't either save you from any claims of racism, and it doesn't make you a racist. So the problem is that many people think you weaken the argument against racism by admitting to any kind of nuance. We can't admire both James Brown and Elvis because then you are not black enough, my friend. I mean, we certainly can't say they were nice slave owners because they were monsters, and if you say they were nice, then you are condoning slavery. Believe me, I have heard that. And the other thing, which is a pet peeve of mine, is that you're not allowed to say Barack Obama is half white. You're not supposed to say that. I can't tell you how many times I've been scolded for pointing out that Barack Obama is half white. I was recently, first of all, obviously, I'm multiracial. And for me, it is very important that if we're going to honor his family, we honor not just his family that has roots in Kenya, but the white grandparents and the white mother that loved him and adored him and nurtured him and helped him to become the man that he is. And yet, I was emceeing a panel on James Baldwin at the Harlem Museum, and there were 3 African-American scholars talking about James Baldwin. And at one point, one of the authors said something about Barack Obama being the first black president and how he might interact with James Baldwin as a black man. And I said, half black. And he turns around and he turns to the audience and starts mugging. And he goes, should I explain to her? Because he assumed I was white. And I said, well, I'm multiracial, so it's important that I point it out. And he goes, oh, you dogged me. And I was like, you dogged yourself, brother. I had nothing to do with you and all your dogging. Look, if you are not multiracial, if there is absolutely no other race in your family tree, raise your hand. 3. Just about everybody is multiracial at this point. We are all the product of the ancestors who came before us, but we're also the product of the teachers who've influenced us. We're the product of the neighbors who've watched us grow, whether that was kindly or less so. How can we be capable of understanding complexity and shading in ourselves and our loved ones? Because we do that pretty well. But we fight against it in our politics and our philosophy. We're capable of cognitive dissonance. Human beings are capable of that. We can hold 2 seemingly opposite thoughts in our heads at the same time. I mean, it is time to stop staring at the bark and step back and look and see the trees. The trees, they're all different sizes. They're all different colors. There's a billion different shades of green. But together, they are one forest. They are interconnected, they are intertwined, they are individuals, but they are interdependent. They are one that makes a whole. They are out of many, one, me and us, all at the same time, not me and then us. It is me and us at the same time together. This is something that is something of a family business for us. My grandfather is known as the Dean of Black Composers, but he was not entirely black. As I said, his grandfather was a Scotch-Irish slave owner. He was part Cherokee, he was part Choctaw, he was part Spanish. But of course, at that time, if you are part black, you are black, period. And he looked traditionally black. I don't look traditionally black. Am I allowed to call myself black, or am I not? My mom is half white. My dad is something. Who knows? When I joined the Black Student Union at the University of Michigan, one of the girls asked me to leave. When I would date black guys and walk through New York City, African American women would scream profanity at me on the street. I guess I'm not allowed to call myself black, but I'm also not allowed to call myself white. So where does that leave me? I'm not going to answer that question for you. I'm just putting it out there. My grandfather was a multiracial man who lost on all sides of the racial argument. He lost among African Americans because he was writing classical music. They called him an Uncle Tom. He lost on the white side because he dared to think that he could enter Carnegie Hall. The only reason my grandfather became famous, became world-renowned, well, there's a few reasons, but the main one is he was really, really, really good. He was extremely good at what he did. I'll tell you how good he was. For the World's Fair in New York City in the 1940s, they decided to hold a national competition for the person that would write the theme song, the theme music for the World's Fair. And 1942, I think. Though some of you are going to have your smartphones out in a second. You're going to check my date. And it was a big deal. It was a big prize money. It was all over the radios. And they said, you can send in 3 pieces. It's going to be completely anonymous. Your composition will not have your name on it. When they got to the end of the competition, the judges of the competition narrowed it down to 2 compositions. And they said, we can't decide between these 2. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring both composers to New York, and we'll decide after we've met them. Then they went back in the files to see where the composer of those compositions, they were both by William Grant Still. And thank goodness, because if they'd brought him and someone else to New York, you can bet he would not have been writing the theme music for the New York World's Fair. This is at a time when blacks were not allowed to attend the World's Fair. They had a special Negro Day once a month when Negroes could go and attend the fair. If he wanted to go on the fair and hear his own music blaring from the speakers, he had to have a police escort. And even with the police escort, he was not allowed to eat any of the food. The only reason he overcame the racial barriers that he did was because he was incredibly good. He also had the help of some extraordinarily influential white people. The blacks didn't help him. There's a couple of reasons for that. They weren't entirely in a position to do so. But he also was not writing the kind of music that was acceptable to people in the black community. Duke Ellington was acceptable to the people in the black community. My grandfather was part of the Harlem Renaissance. He was best friends with Langston Hughes. He wrote art songs. He wrote operas, and he wrote ballets. That was not part of the black experience at that time. And if he was doing that, then he clearly was not a real black man. I can't even imagine how that must have felt, hearing people not only say that, but write it in reviews to him, write it in letters to him. This man who was the first of his family, the first generation of his family born outside of slavery, to be told that he wasn't a real black man. Yes, my grandfather experienced terrible racism from everyone. From everyone. Were the whites worse? Yeah, because they had all the power. So the blacks could insult him, but they didn't do him any harm. The whites could really hurt him, and they did. Does that excuse either group? I don't think so. I don't think so. You know, it's funny because one of my very good friends from college is a young man, young, he's the same age as me, so, named Aaron Dworkin. And Aaron founded an organization called the Sphinx Organization. And if you've never heard of the Sphinx Organization, write it down, because you need to go Google it. You need to know what this guy's doing. I always told him he only started that competition because he wanted to get out of practicing viola. But the Sphinx Organization his entire mission is to get more blacks and Latinos into classical music. I mean, here's the problem. These days, auditions for symphony orchestras are blind. You go in and you play your instrument behind a screen. They can't see you. And I guarantee you, if you're playing Bach, they can't tell whether it's a black guy or a white guy behind the screen. You're all playing Bach, you're all playing it on a violin. There's nothing that gives you away as black or Latino. So why do we have almost no blacks or Latinos playing in our symphony orchestras? I mean, it's a knotty problem. And Aaron's entire mission in life is to solve that one problem. Just that one. He's chosen one specific piece of the puzzle, and he's decided to solve it. It's specific, and it's measurable. And his entire job in life is about head counting. He goes and he counts the black and Latino heads in the orchestra. And then he goes into their administrative offices, and he counts the blacks and the Latino people in their offices. So when he and I were speaking together at a conference up in Idlewild, Michigan, he said his job and mine are at war with one another. We are polar opposites. He takes note of race, he keeps score, I try to blur all the colors, and I reset the scoreboard. But our ultimate goal is pretty much the same. We're both looking for racial equality, racial understanding, racial amity. Aaron says his message is remember race, and my message is now forget it. If we're ever going to achieve equality in this country, we have to remember and forget at the same time. Cognitive dissonance. I'm not, for example, I remember race. I will not sing recitals of my grandfather's music in February. I'm a classically trained soprano. I will not sing any recitals of my grandfather's music in February. No. Because every time someone's trying to schedule their Black History Month is the only time they will ever schedule William Grant Still. Well, it's all fair, right? Because they only play Copland during Jewish History Month. So forget it. You want to hear me sing William Grant Still? It's not going to be in February. Schedule somebody else. I also understand the position, and I have many of them, colleagues in my profession, both in music and in journalism, who will not, they're African American, but they refuse to speak at any conference like this with race in the title. Minority, race, black, African American, they will not appear and they will not speak. And you know what? I understand it and I honor it. Because to a certain extent, come on. How come my grandfather's a black composer and Copland isn't a Jewish composer? How come Jewish is never put in the front of Gershwin? How come he's black all the time and they get to just be Aaron and George? That's not fair and it's not right. Do we need to remember his achievements as for African Americans, the doors that he opened, the fields that he pioneers? Absolutely, remember it and then forget it. Okay? Forget it. I irritate my friends all the time by pointing out that Barack Obama's half white. I mean, as a multiracial person, I've said before, it is very important to me. If we're going to refer to his race at all, we have to honor all of his race. Otherwise, leave race out of it. I mean, oddly, saying that he's half white annoys all my far-right conservative friends because they would love to be able to label him as black. That's their goal. They want him to be black, 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 black. Therefore, he is other, and everything they hate about him is because he is black. He is not us. But it also irritates, of course, my African American friends, because then it's less of an achievement, right? Then he's not our first black president. Yes, he is. Come on. Let's be realistic. Why do we have to speak in circles all the time? So how do we reach racial amity? How do we make e pluribus unum even a distinct possibility rather than a joke, a punchline? Do we become hyper-aware of race? Because honestly, I think we're there. I really do. I mean, do we have to count every one of our brown students in our colleges and universities? And if we start doing that, how do we count them? Do I count? If you were coming to my university, would you label me a minority student? Would I get a minority scholarship or not? I'm not going to answer that question either. You'll have to think about it for yourself. Do we make it then, do we then completely forget it? Do we forget race at all? Then it becomes offensive and not politically correct to even mention someone's race? Rename the NAACP to National Association for People with a Good Tan Base? You know, I mean, human beings come in all different shades. If I were completely white, I would take offense at white too, because let me tell you something. Any scientist will tell you we are all brown. Scientifically, we're all some kind of brown. Some people are just really, really, really light brown. So, forget race. It'd be ridiculous to pretend there are absolutely no cultural differences between the races. I mean, that's ridiculous. I guess the rabbi went home, but I was joking to the rabbi. I used to tell my Jewish family all the time, if you don't want to be stereotyped, stop doing those things. I mean, to take offense when someone makes a joke about a cultural difference, which we can all pretty much accept, we're among friends, we can admit, that's pretty stupid, right? I mean, to take offense of that kind of thing, does it help you or does it hurt you? Stereotypes hurt, absolutely. We have to remember that. Stereotypes don't just hurt your feelings, they are destructive. Stereotypes keep people from getting jobs. Stereotypes keep people from getting a college education. Absolutely. But not every single comment about a person's hair or their clothing or their speech is a hurtful stereotype. So put it out of your mind. I mean, we really need to create an atmosphere in which it is okay to ask difficult questions and say sometimes awkward things. It should be okay to talk openly about things that right now will get you labeled as a racist. When your coworker asks to touch your hair, African Americans, you have two choices at that point. You can get very offended, and I don't blame you. You can call them a racist. You can walk away in a huff. But let me ask you something. What then is the product of that? Have you helped them or yourself? Have you furthered the cause of understanding at all? Or have you just made yourself feel better and more self-righteous and more justified? You're justified, absolutely. But what have you helped? I saw you rub that guy's head. You better have made a wish. Why not learn to use the phrase, "That's racist," and let me explain why? Give people the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they're just asking the question because they're really stupid. And I mean that in the kindest way possible. Maybe they just don't know. I had a neighbor, I still own my house in Detroit. My neighbor, the sweetest possible old guy, World War II vet, Marcel, comes to me one day and says, Celeste, can you get my mail while I'm going on vacation? I said, absolutely, Marcel, sure. He goes, because our post office is in Detroit, and I don't want those people to know I'll be away. I said, Marcel, I'm one of those people. I'm black and I'm broke. And he said, well, I'm not racist. I said, you are. You are racist. It's okay. I love you. I'm still going to get your mail. But you are a racist. Make no mistake about that. I never miss an opportunity to talk to somebody when they're saying something stupid. I never let it go. I never, ever walk away from a racist comment, not once in my life, and my coworkers can vouch for me. I had a German couple. I worked at a dinner theater when I was working my way through college in Arizona. A German couple sat down at my table, had the greatest time ever. At the end of their meal, I bring them their check, and they say, "Can we ask you something? How come there's no black people in this restaurant?" I said, "Well, it's Arizona. We have lots of Latinos. We have lots of Native Americans. We don't really have a large population of African Americans." And they said, "Oh, it's such a relief to look around the room and not see black faces." And I peeled up a chair. And I said, "Let's talk." And I explained to them how rude they were. I literally said to them, that was unbelievably rude. And I'll tell you why. I'm part black. The fact that you assumed that I wasn't is just out of your stupidity. But the fact that you say stuff like that, not knowing who you're speaking to, that's just rude. Now, granted, I had ulterior motives. They left me a $60 tip. But they will also never forget the fact that they were scolded. And that moment, that uncomfortable moment when your face is burning and you know you've said something, you need to extend that. You need to make it painful. You need to make it memorable. Honestly, that's how people learn. Do you really think, does every single person in this room think that you've never said something that somebody else thought might have been racist? Whether it was about a white person or a black person or an Asian person or a Latino person, you've all at some point said something that you didn't know hurt someone's feelings. You have. Unless there's a newborn in the house, and I don't see one. You have. So give other people the benefit of the doubt that you give yourself. And you know the benefit of the doubt that you give yourself. Oh, that was a boneheaded thing to say, but I'm not a racist. Well, guess what? Lots of people say boneheaded things, and lots of people are not racists. I don't want you to ever think that I'm always the victim of racism and I'm never the perpetrator. And to demonstrate, I will tell you the story of the time that I was a terrible, terrible racist. I was doing a fellowship with the Institutes for Journalism and Natural Resources, and that's where they're training you to report better on environmental issues. And you fly to Milwaukee, that's where you start, and you travel for 2.5 weeks through the northern part of Wisconsin, all through the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, and the farthest south that you come is Traverse City. So if this is the mitten, Traverse City is right about up here. It's where they have the Cherry Festival. Anyone who knows those areas knows that there's something distinctive about northern Wisconsin, the Upper Peninsula, and northern Michigan. And it's that everyone is the same color, and it's not brown. And I didn't realize that I felt uncomfortable. I grew up in Los Angeles. I mean, obviously, half or more of my family is black. I didn't realize how it was making me feel until I got to Traverse City, and I was walking away from the restaurant with the rest of the group, and I saw an African-American couple. They were tourists from Detroit, and I ran up to them and embraced them. And I went, "Oh, civilization." And I was telling this story to one of my white friends, and she said, "Could you please stop telling that story? It's like you're saying that all rural whites are from the cast of Deliverance." I said, "You know what? Welcome to the freaking club. How about all the people who think every urban black is from Boys in the Hood?" And we ended up having a fantastic conversation. That was the first time she had ever kind of understood what it felt like when somebody was making assumptions about other people. She was really offended, and her feelings were hurt that I had said I felt uncomfortable surrounded by white people. And you know what? I can understand that. I totally can understand that. If it was going the other way, that she felt uncomfortable surrounded by people who are kind of brownish, I would feel bad also. But she made the choice to tell me and speak up, and we had a conversation about it rather than her just most of the time, what do? We don't even say anything. We just hold it in our head and we're mad, and we go back later and either rant on Facebook or we call one of our friends on the phone and we say, you wouldn't believe this jerk ass and what they said to me today. It has to be okay to say stuff like that. It has to be okay. We have to forgive it, or we will never further the conversation about race. You have to give other people the exact same amount of leeway that you give yourselves. And you know we all give ourselves a lot of leeway. I was tired. I had a bad day. I wasn't thinking. All those excuses you give yourself, leave some of the excess for the people that you talk to that are strangers, and give them the benefit of the doubt. Look, one of my unique features is my diversity. I mean, you cannot tell a joke without offending me. I am black, I am Jewish, I am Native American, I'm Spanish, I'm Scotch-Irish, and I'm a Buddhist, okay? I could make that choice. I could get very self-righteous about bagels. I could get angry and possessive of Malcolm X. I could get very, very scolding about Sitting Bull. If I wanted, I could. I could make a lot of people feel really, really bad. But then there's the other choice, which is just to laugh about it. And that's the choice that I make. Because you know what? It brings me a lot more friends than the other way. The other way, I end up feeling really self-righteous, but I'm alone. So, if it is okay to tease people from California about being too laid back, then it is okay to tease your Jewish friends about kvetching about their health. Okay? That's okay. If one is okay, the other is okay. If it's okay to tease my friends in Minnesota about eating cheese and hot dish with crumbled Fritos on top, it is okay to tease me about loving fried chicken. That is okay. It doesn't mean the person teasing me is a racist. They're just telling a joke. We really hurt the cause of racial amity when we make the consequences for mistakes so very high. So, out of many nationalities, I am one person. That's true of most of the people in here. We have to remember the cultures, the influences that make me who I am, and then we have to forget them. Because in the end, I'm just Celeste. I am flawed like the rest of you. I'm doing the best that I can in a very tough life and a very tough world. And I think that's the exact same thing that we can say of our nation. Flawed, complex, doing its best. There may be dozens of ingredients in a recipe, but when it gets into the melting pot, we just call it stew. Out of many, one. Thank you.